All right, everybody. Long time no see. I know I haven't made videos in a while, and to be honest, I don't think I'm going to be consistent about making videos again, just because I got kind of caught up in schoolwork and decided to sort of devote my time to that. I often kind of feel like making videos, but I only get to about 50 to 80% motivation, and then it just kind of peters out. But I was shown this video on my server, and taking a look at it really caught my eye. If anybody has watched the video that I made about the difference on syntax and semantics, and I think I titled it, "When is formalization good to ask for?" It kind of shows this distinctness of when formalization doesn't actually help forward a conversation. And I kind of just wanted to go over this video because I thought it was a very good example of where formalization wouldn't progress the conversation and that the focus needs to be on semantics. And we're going to see a need for the principle of charity in order to move this conversation along. We're going to see that not actually be the case, and we're going to watch it kind of spiral out of control. So let's start this. I'm gonna put this on 1.5 times speed. I hope nobody minds, but it is a 40-minute long video, so it would be a lot better to go through a little quicker.
Go ahead and give your argument
Yeah, hey, what's up? Can you hear me?
loud and clear.
All right. So we need to define what a trans person is, right?
Right, so this is a call for semantic clarity, right? Putting definitions into logical form doesn't actually help each other communicate. So, Hypocrite's going to say, well, okay, let's make sure we're talking about the same thing as we progress through this argument.
You cut out, pardon?
I think we need to define what transgender means.
Well, no, what we need from you is just the argument.
Right? So here he's saying, look, I want to make sure semantically we're on the same level. So we're talking about the same thing when we use this word. Ask Yourself says, no, we don't need to do that. What we need is an argument. We need to see the inference structure.
So if you think that that proposition is true and you have an argument for it, you can deliver that.
Well, the argument would be the same one that you made when you gave your definition of delusion last.
So unfortunately, Hypocrite doesn't stand his ground here and just accepts that, well, okay, let's go ahead and make an argument.
Time.
So what are the premises?
So trans women are not women, I guess would be the premise. And so to believe that is a delusion.
Trans women are not women, therefore transgenderism is a delusion.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's invalid. We could probably make it into a valid argument.
One key thing to note is that not every argument needs to be valid because there are such things as inductive arguments, but I do think that the particular way that he's going about it would require a deductive argument. This is just a side note. It's just like it's not automatically a problem if an argument's invalid if it's inductive.
Let's see. Let's go. I'll come up with the formalization. You can tell me if you agree with it. So let's go P1. Let's see. How is it that you phrased that? Transgender women aren't women. Okay. So if transgender women aren't women, okay, so that's in. Then if a trans woman believes she's a woman, she's delusional? Is that like the idea?
Sure.
Here, I'll type it up and we can see if you agree with the form. Let me just make it into a proper argument. One sec. I'm going to put it in general when I have it done.
So we're just going to watch Ask Yourself turn this into a deductive argument. This does take quite a while. Maybe I'll bump it up to 2 times. just so we can get through
Okay,
this
there you
part.
go. So that's in general. So it's just modus ponens. If transgender, then if a trans woman believes she's a woman, she's delusional. Premise 2, transgender women aren't women. Conclusion, therefore, if a transgender woman believes she's a woman, she's delusional. Is that what you're trying to do?
Hold on a second. Let me just take a quick look at it. Oh shit, I did the wrong thing. Fucking hell. This Discord shit. Why does he gotta make it so complicated? Where is the...
I hit you accidentally moved yourself over to the other voice channel, so I just dragged you back here. Don't know if you talked while you were in there.
Yeah, I
I'm
don't
just
know
gonna
how to
he
see it.
he searches for the
Where do I
argument
click
for a
on to see the
while,
thing?
so
So-
I'm gonna get to where he actually
Right.
finds it.
And you should
Okay.
see it there.
I
I
got
can
it.
I can
Okay. So, I mean, I know this is kind of a minor point, but you know, this isn't actually P therefore Q. It's if okay. Well, anyway, you guys can read P1. Let me make sure it shows up on OBS. No, it kind of cuts it off a little bit. So I'm just gonna move that down for everybody. There we go. Should be able to see that now. It says if transgender women aren't women, then if a transgender woman believes she's a woman, she's delusional. If you have an if statement, you need to start another hypothetical. So this should be... Oh, and the other one is if transgender women aren't women. Anytime you have a not statement, you are to take it out and put a not sign before the statement. There is some cases in logic where a not statement doesn't translate well into just taking it out and putting it a not symbol because it's not always just negation. But I'm gonna save those cases for a different video. Don't worry about it. So anyways, this should be not P, so it's not the case that if transgender women are women, then if a transgender woman, so we're going to need this, and we're going to need another one, and we're going to want to put brackets on here because this statement implies this hypothetical. So this would be the actual symbol, not P therefore Q. It would be this. Then the next one would be not P, and then the conclusion would be Q therefore R. Oh, whatever. You know, I don't care that much.
post it again. Yeah.
It just seems weird that like somebody obsessed with logic can't seem to do logic correctly.
Got Bryn spamming it, so there you go.
If transgender women aren't women...
Yeah, guys, don't spam it. Just here. There it is once, so you can read it clearly.
Then if a trans woman believes she's a woman, she's delusional. Sure.
See, now when he says sure, I don't think he's actually sure, which is sort of problematic, so I don't know what the point of this exercise is. Like, it seems to help ask yourself, but not help anyone else.
Okay, so there's a few problems with it. Just to point out, one, the conclusion isn't that transgender women are delusional. The conclusion is an implication that if a trans woman has a particular belief, she's delusional. That's to set aside problems with the premise.
Okay, but what I was trying to get at is that the definition, that belief is part of the definition of trans woman.
Well, the argument that you've given right here has a... so you want to say all transgender women believe they're... Okay, so we can try to rewrite. Let's see if we can get a rewrite that works a bit better. All right, let's try...
And this is one of the more interesting parts because, especially when you're going to compare it to later on what actually happens, is that Ask Yourself just accepts Hypocrite's fix here is to add in, by definition, transgender people believe they are a gender.
If
that's going to matter a lot
transgender
coming up.
women, all right, by definition, believe they are women, and we'll go, and it's false that they are women, then transgender women are delusional. I'll even help you generalize this to trans people as a whole. Just let me
I want to just skip ahead because
often what'll happen
is just a lot of typing out.
Women are delusional. Okay, so if someone is trans, they are delusional. So we could go if transgender people, so let's get it away from women. If transgender people, by
Yeah, he
the other
tries
sex,
one
and
thing,
that's
it
where the
doesn't really
equivocation
work.
definition
So he
should
finds a
be
different way to
therefore
write it.
That's not a straw man of
I'm
yours.
just going to wait until he's actually finished.
The transgender is no, then and let's conclusion. Therefore, transgender women are.
All right, there we go. So here we have some updated arguments here. If transgender women, by definition, believe they are women, and it's false that they're women, then they are delusional. And then it's just finishing that out. Yeah. And it's false would definitely be a negated Q, but whatever.
Delusional, therefore are. So then the second argument is just going to go, if transgender women are delusional, then by parallel reasoning, so are all other trans people. R implies S. It's just taking R, the conclusion of the prior argument. Premise 2, transgender women are delusional. It's already established in the prior argument. That's just R. And then conclusion, therefore, by parallel reasoning, so are all other trans people. Therefore, S. Is this an accurate representation of your argument?
Yes.
All right, so he accepts it.
Oh, yeah.
And I think this one's a little more clearly written than the other one, so it's a little easier, and it seems like he's a little more confident when he says yes to this one.
Yes.
If do you want a minute to read it over? I'm very patient.
No, that is it. That's my argument.
Okay, so there's multiple lines of attack here. One would be that a transgender person doesn't actually require the belief that they are of the other gender or sex.
All right. So we're going to see AY's position, and this is going to be just a theme that we're going to see throughout this entire conversation, back and forth. A transgender person, by definition, does not have to believe they are, let's see, how did he say it?
Attack here. One would be that a transgender person doesn't actually require the belief that they are of the other gender or
that they are of the other gender. Let's change that to belief. And Hypocrite's position is a transgender person is a person who believes and identifies as the other gender. Right? So ask yourself's definition is just, I mean, this isn't a definition of transgender. For him, he's just saying this is, you know, it doesn't require this factor to be transgender. Hypocrite's position is that it does require that for the definition of transgender. Now, for me, I'm not here to settle that conversation to say who's right in their definitions, but what I want to talk about here is how do we progress conversations? Like, what happens when you have this sort of problem? Well, one thing you can do is yell and scream at each other about whose definition is correct, right? Another option is you can appeal to some sort of authoritative definition. You know, you can say, well, whatever's in the dictionary or elsewhere. That's not a bad option. It's better than the first thing I suggested of yelling and screaming at each other. But this has the problem of just trying to win a definition, right? And when you win the definition, then the conversation can only take place around that particular definition, right? So let's say that these are two different concepts. Well, we don't actually know what ask yourself's concept is yet. He hasn't stated it in the video. He sort of says something later, but it's only half fleshed out, so we're not completely ever sure what he means. And I'll explain that when we get there. But we could have two different concepts at the same time, and we could call one transgender 1 and the other one transgender 2, right? Just to signify that we're working with two different concepts. Then you can find out if you guys actually have meaningful disagreements by running the argument through both understandings, right? Then someone can say, well, under your definition, I could see how it's a problem, but under my definition, my argument holds. And then the other person might end up agreeing, okay, actually, I agree that if it was using your definition, then your argument holds, but if it's using my definition, then it doesn't hold. That's progress, right? It's better than just fighting over a word. Just to kind of understand conceptually that you actually do agree, it's just you disagree on the word's usage. That's a pretty good conclusion coming out of debates, right? I would call that progress. That's how a lot of conversations that I have with people end up going. I think I recently had one where we were talking about mental representation. I was talking to a psychologist, and for them, mental representation doesn't mean like the experience, the phenomenal experience of something. I still don't actually know what they mean by mental representation. Like I still have to figure out what that means to them, but it doesn't, it's not like the what it's like to be definition. It's not the phenomenal experience of it. So I know that our conversation and all the disagreements we had are kind of dead in the water. All those disagreements kind of need to be refocused through a new lens so that we can continue the conversation. And I consider that progress. But we're going to see what happens when things like that are not done.
As long as it's true of them, they're trans. They don't have to even believe it. You can be trans without knowing. So P1, I would say, is false.
You,
And another way to ask yourself is saying, okay, look, I have a definition of trans, so your argument's false, right? So my definition of transgender, it doesn't require belief, so premise one is false, right? That's a much worse thing to say that, well, with my understanding of transgender women, this argument would be false. But perhaps with your definition of transgender women, this argument would be true, right? That to me is a better progress of a conversation.
no, so this is where we need to have a definition of transgender.
And that's a good thing to say.
Well, I'm objecting to your premise one right there. When you say,
see, we need to have a definition, right? Like, we need to not talk past each other. And he says, no, I'm objecting to P1. Yeah, but you're objecting to P1 because of different definitions. You need to realize these sorts of things.
if transgender women by definition believe they are women and it's false that they are women, then transgender women are delusional. So I'm saying that it's not the case that they by definition believe they're women, right? Transgender person, if you want a definition, is just going to be someone whose gender identity and sex differ.
Right, so here Ask Yourself offers up a different definition, right? A person whose gender identity and sex differ. We're gonna go over that. So this is not a definition. This is just disagreement with IH's definition. Then he offers this. Ask Yourself offers transgender, a person whose gender identity and sex differ. Hypocrite obviously requires belief.
So it's not required that they have a belief about it differing. So that wrecks P1.
I hate when he says things like that. Wrecks people. I have a different definition of transgender, so that wrecks your argument. Who says things like that?
Okay, well, the definition I'm using is somebody who identifies as the opposite sex.
You don't need to. I'd reject that. You don't need to identify as trans to be trans.
You don't need to identify as trans to be trans. Ask Yourself's definition is a person whose gender identity and sex differ. But you don't even have to have this? So it's a little unclear what Ask Yourself means here.
According to who?
What I take trans to mean. Someone whose gender identity and sex differ.
So it's wrong because it's what I take it to mean. I mean, who cares, right? It's fine that you have an understanding of transgender and that it's different. But to say that because you have a disagreement that it's some sort of authority or that anyone else should care, I mean, that should be signaling into your mind like, oh, this is going to be a problem for the conversation.
You're talking about.
There's no such thing as gender identity. That's not even a real thing.
All right. Okay. Um, there's no such thing as gender identity. So this is a little confusing for Hypocrite's position because it seems for him is that someone who identifies as a gender is what a transgender person is, but there is such thing as gender identity. If I was to try and steelman what I think he's trying to say, is that people who have gender identity aren't identifying with anything real, right? It would be like identifying with, you know, some nonsense letters. I have a blah, blah, blah identity, right? You can say that, but it doesn't actually mean anything. So he might be saying that, like, yeah, I see that people are saying that they identify as something, but it doesn't actually amount to anything.
Okay, so let's just make sure we understand where we're at. So right now we've got a double syllogism. I'm objecting to premise 1 of the first argument because it asserts that transgender women by definition believe that they're women. I'm telling you, I could say it's false, or I could just play agnostic, but I would just go as far as to say it's false.
I don't know what it means to say that a definition is false. Right? Like, what do you mean? I have a different definition than you, therefore your argument's false. That I mean, the words just represent concepts for them to be able to speak to each other. Are you saying that he's not allowed to have this word? Is that what you mean by false? Like there's some sort of real thing that these words must mean? I mean, it's nice to stay in common language. You know, use the words that everybody thinks they mean so that you can have a productive conversation rather than having to redefine the entire dictionary in order to begin the conversation. So I definitely understand when you want to disagree with someone whose definition is just completely so outside of the norm. But for me, listening to this conversation, I could both understand what I hypocrite means and what ask yourself means. You know, like where they're starting to go. It's not like they're saying transgender things are and then pointing at hippopotamuses. You know, it's not that bizarre. So it's not such a big problem to grant it.
Don't need to believe that they're women. It just needs to be the case that their gender identity and sex differ. Now,
a transgender female is a male who identifies as female, or a man who identifies as a woman. That's the definition that I would use.
Oh, I'd reject that.
Okay, so they've rejected each other's definition, right? What do you do? What do you do in a conversation when you reject each other's definitions? Well, let's find out what they did.
Well, I reject your false, made-up idea of gender identity.
Okay, so you're just talking about something else to me. So do you have an argument against what I'm actually saying?
Now, this I think is kind of a Weasley move, right? So, you know, ask yourself goes, well, okay, well, we're talking about two different things. So now you have to provide an argument against my definition. Why? Why would he have to do that? He came here with a particular argument. He gave and agreed to that argument, right? And he's sticking by his meaning of it. Why isn't it ask yourself's job to figure out if it's wrong, if his argument is wrong, based on the way that he understands the words that he's using himself, right? Why not just say, I hypocrite, I understand your definition, but I still have a problem with it here. But no, he says, no. I have a different definition, so I require you to make a new argument that fits my definition of it. Who's to say he even has one? Why does he have to have one? He could just say no. Like if we used your definition, maybe I would agree with you, but I don't. Here's what I'm trying to say.
Right? Do you have a way to establish trans people are delusional where you're actually talking about the same thing as me when you're talking about a trans?
Well, we have two different definitions. So your definition isn't even a real thing. How can you empirically measure someone's gender identity, or how can you prove to me that gender identity is a real thing that I should recognize and respect?
Right. Okay. So here we have some sort of pathways that we could go with this conversation, right? Ask yourself. Okay. Well, we'll label this as pathways that might go somewhere. Could recognize IH's definition and dispute IH's argument using that definition. That's one way you can go, right? Here, IH is saying that there's no such thing as gender identity. And ask yourself is saying a person whose gender identity and sex differ, right? So if IH doesn't even think that this component exists, right? This isn't even a thing, or it references something that doesn't exist, right? So it's like people say and believe that they have an identity, but it doesn't reference anything. Then that's another conversation, right? Is gender identity a thing? That's another conversation you could have to try and put forward. Because we have ask yourself on one side saying yes, IH saying no, and we can generally ask the question why.
So first of all, now you really have a tendency to try to bait me into things, and it's very hard not to do them. But just to get rid of your kind of bogus, like I'm using a proprietary definition thing. I mean, you can literally just hit Wikipedia. Transgender people have a gender identity or gender expression that differs from their sex assigned at birth.
Okay, well, let's look. Wikipedia, transgender. That differs from their sex assigned at birth. Yeah, it looks like ask yourself's definition seems to hold. Not that I know why you have to actually use Wikipedia, but sure. I mean, he found a definition to support his position. Gender identity is the personal sense of one's own gender. So what I would wonder here is if we think a personal sense means you have to, believe it to be the case. I mean, personal sense is a little bit of a vague. In some sort of way, you have to be aware of it to have a personal sense. But, this is going to get further and further down semantically, which is a good thing sometimes. Like, sometimes that's just how the conversation has to go in order to get anywhere. Okay. Let's go back to the video.
You sure you want to go with Wikipedia?
Definition seems fine to me.
Okay, I clicked on trans woman on Wikipedia, and the first line of it reads, a trans woman is a woman who was assigned male at birth.
A trans woman is someone who was assigned male at birth. Is that really what it says? It doesn't make any sense. Trans woman. A trans woman is a woman who was assigned male at birth. That doesn't make any sense, because then somebody couldn't decide that they were trans later. In fact, the only way they could be trans is if someone else assigns them a male at birth. I guess Hypocrite's point is that Wikipedia definitions aren't so great.
Okay. Woman there probably refers to gender.
Okay, well, that's delusional.
What's the delusion?
a woman is an adult human female.
So when we look at your argument here, if transgender women by definition believe they are women, and it's false that they are women, then transgender women are delusional. When you say transgender women by definition believe that they are women, that's not true. You could be trans without knowing it.
No, you can't.
Right. Okay. So let's write that one down. That seems kind of important to ask yourselves understanding. Ask yourself, a trans person can be trans without knowing it. That to me seems like a controversial position. That's not really how I understand trans, but you know, if I wanted to be charitable, then I can just grant the way he's saying it.
It's part of the definition. A trans is somebody who identifies as the opposite sex. That's what it means.
No, it's just someone whose gender and sex differ. Now, if you're just talking about...
See, this is confusing. Ask Yourself says in different points that it's a person whose gender identity and sex differ, but he also says transgender, a person whose gender and sex differ. So he sometimes takes out the word identity and he sometimes leaves it in. So unless these literally mean the exact same thing, then there's a problem with him doing that, right? Because if this is a different concept than this, then he has two different definitions.
Some other thing. It's not what I'm arguing with you about. Do you actually have an argument against transgenderism as I'm using the term?
There's no such thing as gender.
Wait, so I want...
So he's saying I can't make an argument against transgender because your particular definition it is incoherent, right? It has a word that there is nothing for. So it'd be the same as saying a person whose and sex differ. And then in Hypocrite's opinion, ask yourself as saying, do you have an argument that this is delusional? And he's saying, well, I can't make an argument against something that is incoherent.
I want to be clear about what we're saying. So when I object to your first premise, by that it's not the case that a transgender woman by definition believes that they are a woman, do you understand that or do you not understand that?
I understand that we're operating off of different definitions, and
I think that's a good answer, right? Like it when he puts it into the phrase like, do you understand it or not? It sounds like, look, are you going to be stupid about this, or are you going to be smart and agree with me, right? And I Hypocrite's saying, no, I'm not playing the game. The problem is we have different definitions.
Yours is incorrect.
Right. So you're attacking you're attacking a position that's not my position, right? Transgender person doesn't have to identify.
You're attacking a position that's not my position. You're attacking a position that's not my position. That is weird phrasing too, because he's not attacking a person's position, right? When I Hypocrite makes this argument that you know, if a person has this identity but you know they're not of that sex, then it's a delusion. That's not against Ask Yourself. That's just an argument that something is the case. You know, that transgender people are delusional. It doesn't have to target Ask Yourself or the person next door or anybody else, right? It's something to agree with or disagree with, regardless of who holds it.
They don't have to know that they're trans. You can be trans without knowing you're trans.
Right, but that's my position.
Oh, so you're just talking about something else to me. So do you actually have an argument against my position or not?
I don't know, like, what's his position? Like, is Ask Yourself making an argument? I suppose this makes it a little more confusing because I don't have the context of what Ask Yourself's position is because it hasn't been presented in this particular video.
Well, I think that if we're going to have a fundamental disagreement about what a trans person is, we should settle that in order to settle the debate. Wouldn't you agree?
That is very reasonable to me.
No, I'd just say you're talking past me, right? So if you actually have a criticism of the word as I'm using it, if you're going to...
Wait, so you're just talking past me. It should be we're talking past each other because we both have different definitions. Um, yeah, this all seems to be framing that the problem in definitions seems to be Hypocrite's problem and his problem alone. And I don't exactly get what would authorize anyone to make that sort of statement. They're talking past each other because they both have different definitions.
show that what I mean when I say a trans person, which is someone whose gender identity and sex entails being delusional, then I want to hear the argument for that. So far, you've just delivered an argument that assumes that trans people have to have the belief that they are women. And we haven't even clarified the fact that you're obviously equivocating between gender and sex in there. I'm not even addressing that yet. I'm just saying they don't...
I really hate when Ask Yourself puts these like side comments in, like, oh, and not even to address the 30 other errors you made. It's like you could always make that claim, but unless you're actually addressing them, then it just sounds like you're poisoning the well. You're trying to make this guy look stupid without actually expressing why. Right? Oh, well, there's all these other things you're doing wrong, but let's all put that to the side. Let's put it to the side and not talk about what a complete idiot you are. Let's put that to the side.
Even need to have a belief at all, right? If their gender identity and sex differ, they're trans. So the first premise is just straightforwardly false.
There's no such thing as gender identity, Isaac. It's not a real thing. It's just a made-up concept to validate the delusion.
So
right, I mean that's an interesting comment, and that's like the second pathway that I put here. Is gender identity a thing? Like, why do they disagree that it's a thing or not? First, we could identify what this means. Ask Yourself seems to think it is a thing. Hypocrite says it's not.
So when I tell you that by transgender, I mean someone whose gender identity and sex differ, right? Do you have an argument that someone whose gender identity and sex differ is delusional?
Right. So again, this is what Hypocrite hears. He's hearing nonsense. I think you're saying something incoherent. You have to make this coherent for me to make an argument against it. How am I supposed to make an argument against something I don't think is coherent?
There's no such thing as gender. You're delusional for believing that gender identity is a real thing.
Okay, so you're trying to say there's no, let's see if we can make an argument of that, right? So when I tell you
hold on,
that
hold
you're
on.
What? No,
don't go. Don't type out another essay.
No, we're going to be systematic. We're going to be systematic, right? We want to find out if what you're saying actually makes sense. That's why we use things like formal logic, right? So your premise one says if transgender women by
I really don't think this needs a formal structure. It's just figure out whether gender identity is a thing or not. Just offer each other. I mean, if Ask Yourself's the person saying it is a thing, then just say what you think it is. This is the simplest way of doing this, not making another syllogism.
definition believe they're women, then it's false that they are women. Now, I'm telling you, a transgender woman does not need to have the belief that they're a woman. If their gender identity and...
Like, what is this, like an authoritative? I'm telling you. Is that like the argument for why his definition is the authoritative one?
Sex differ, then they're trans.
That's not what a trans woman is.
Do you have an argument against the term? Do you have an argument that transgender people are delusional that doesn't equivocate on transgenderism, let alone equivocate also?
That doesn't equivocate on transgenderism. It doesn't equivocate? How is it equivocating? This doesn't make any sense. That doesn't equivocate on transgenderism. In order for Hypocrite to be equivocating, that means he would be using the same word in two different fashions, right? That's how equivocation works. It's you have a word that has two different meanings, and then you use it in one context to prove something in a different context, and that's the basis of an equivocation. Hypocrite is disagreeing with Ask Yourself's definition and he's staying consistent to his own definition. So that's not an equivocation. So I don't even know what ask yourself means there.
On gender identity and sex, which we can talk, right? You know what I'm talking about when I talk about transgenderism. I'm talking about someone whose gender identity and sex differ.
Yeah, ask yourself says, you know what I'm talking about, when literally Hypocrite says, I don't know what you mean by gender identity. There's no such thing. There's no such thing as gender identity. There's no such thing as gender. But then ask yourself saying, you know what I mean by it. Clearly he doesn't.
Do you have an argument that can show that someone whose gender identity and sex differ is delusional?
How do you empirically measure somebody's gender identity in order to know that it differs?
You love to ask questions whenever I push you in a corner.
I don't see how he's pushed in a corner. I think he's trying to ask questions. I think he's trying to point out that I don't think it's a thing because we don't have an empirical way of verifying it, right? Whether that's a good argument or not, that's irrelevant. They could figure that out later. But they have to, like, the problem is they don't really know how to progress the conversation. That's kind of why I wanted to make this video in the first place, is just to point out the difficulties when you don't really have a clue on how to progress an argument and you just keep asserting your definition in order to try and win.
Do you have an argument that shows that if someone's gender identity and sex differ, they are delusional?
That's like asking me if I have...
So again, he just keeps asking them this, right? Like, ask yourself goes back, oh no, let's not clarify what this means. I just want you to give me an argument against it. Like, I don't need to clarify it. I want you to provide an argument anyways.
I have an argument that shows that the fucking flying spaghetti monster isn't the same thing as the rainbow Christmas tree. There's no such thing as gender identity, Isaac. It doesn't exist. You can't measure it. You can't test for it.
We're just talking about gender.
There's no such thing as gender either, as far as I'm concerned.
See, he says we're not talking about gender identity. We're just talking about gender. Ask yourself has literally said gender identity. I shouldn't say literally. It's just such a figure of speech. He said gender identity like at least 5 times, hasn't he? In his own definition. And then he says we're not talking about gender identity.
Gender is just going to be like the sort of group of characteristics that are typically associated with sex. So there's like a lot of them are like behavioral or psychological.
Okay. Now we're getting somewhere to what ask yourself means by transgender. Where do we have? Transgender, person whose gender identity. Well, now he's clarifying this one. But unfortunately, he's kind of operating under 2 different ways of saying it. So I'm going to put it under the one that he was clarifying at the time. Gender is a group of characteristics. What did he say? Typical of a sex?
Gender is just going to be like the sort of group of characteristics that are typically associated with
that are typically associated
sex. So there's like a lot of them are like
with sex, and then he says behavioral or psychological.
Behavioral or psychological.
Now that's fine if we stick to that transgender is a person whose gender and sex differ. But if we go up to gender identity, the other way that ask yourself is saying it, we actually have to make sure that this and this are identical in ask yourself. Like there can't be any notable difference. I mean, personally, when I hear gender identity, I think somebody is consciously stating what gender they are. You know, as in I identify as a male, I identify as a female. That's what, to me, a gender identity is. And that's how I could see it different from gender. But, you know, maybe ask yourself doesn't see it like that. I don't know.
Right. So I can accept that definition, but then that's irrelevant. If you say I'm a woman, you're not saying I use a woman's gender, you're saying I'm a woman. So it's the idea of gender as you're using it is irrelevant.
A trans woman doesn't going to this, right? A transgender woman doesn't need to say she's a woman. If her gender identity and sex differ, she's trans. She doesn't
See, now he's back to gender identity.
have to have a belief that they differ. She could be trans, and she could be delusional about not being trans.
It's in the definition on Wikipedia, and you wanted to use Wikipedia. Like, a trans woman is a woman is the first line of the entry of trans women on Wikipedia.
Well, I've told you perfectly clearly what I mean by transgender, right? A transgender.
Has he? Has he really told us perfectly clearly? I mean, I think if we just take these two, we're sort of getting somewhere.
Person is someone whose gender identity and sex differ.
Why does he keep saying gender identity?
Empirically, like that's meaningless. That doesn't mean that's like saying they have the wrong level of midichlorians.
Do you have an argument that actually shows that if someone's gender identity and sex differ, they are delusional?
There's no such thing as gender identity, Isaac.
No, we just established that there is, IHIP, right?
How did we establish that?
Well, we didn't actually establish that. We established gender. We didn't establish that gender identity and gender mean the same thing. That's pretty important. Like, if you can get Hypocrite to sign off that this means this, which means this, then we would get somewhere.
Characteristics that are typically associated with one or the other sex.
Right, so you can say that behaviors are gendered, but that's not the same thing as saying like a person has a gender identity.
So, okay, so now here's Hypocrite saying this is different than this, right? So, where do we say? Hypocrite's rejection is that someone can have gendered behaviors, we'll say differently, gendered behaviors, and not have a gender identity, right? So Hypocrite saying, you know, like a man could have traits that are more typical, that are, you know, are more typically associated with a female, right? So wearing a dress, I guess, wearing perfume, something. And that doesn't constitute a gender identity, right? They didn't get an identity out of it. That it's just like a few different behaviors. So he's sort of rejecting that connection. Strangely, this is a point where inference structure might actually help.
Gender just refers. We're talking about gender, right? Just gender broadly. We're not separating into expression and identity and stuff like that. We're just saying gender.
See, now that's false. Let's go back.
Gender just refers. We're talking about gender, right? Just gender broadly. We're not separating into expression and identity and stuff like that. We're just saying.
But you've been saying gender identity over and over again. What do you mean we're not talking about it?
Saying gender.
Like, this has been one of his definitions over and over again. A person whose gender identity and sex differ. And now he's saying, well, we're only talking about gender. I mean, you kind of need to be consistent.
And that refers to that set of traits that's typically associated with one or the other sex, roughly, right? So we're talking about psychological traits. We're talking about, expressive traits like maybe how they dress or their vocal inflection. You know full well that there's a set of traits that are typically associated with being one or the other sex, right? Do you deny that?
No, like
okay, so you agree that what's being referred to by gender is coherent. Now, do you have an argument that if someone's sex and gender differ, they are delusional?
So Hypocrite is not agreeing with this. What Hypocrite is saying that this particular definition is how would I phrase this? Right? That's a good way of... I don't know how to make an arrow up. Oh, there we go. We did it. He's saying that this is gendered behaviors, not gender. Right? He's saying a gender isn't a thing. There's not just a gender. There are gendered behaviors. So he's saying, while you can do things typically like a female, that doesn't give you the gender female, right? It doesn't put that label on you. It wouldn't make sense to call you a female just because you do some things typical of females. Ask yourself is saying, he's saying having gendered behaviors constitutes a gender. Right. So we'll put this as hypocrite. And ask yourself, right? So here's another semantic disagreement of what gender, or what this is a concept, right? They're having a disagreement of what to call this. Hypocrite wants to call it gendered behaviors because he doesn't think it should lead to a label. Ask yourself saying that it does, by definition, lead to that label, right? Again, it's fine to have disagreements, but it's also good to recognize what the disagreements are so that you can progress a conversation.
Right, because the syllogism that we have here says, if transgender women by definition believe they are women and it's false that they are women, then transgender women are delusional. Now, they don't require a belief there, right? As long as their gender identity and sex differ, then you're talking about someone who's trans. So all your, and there's additional problems. One second.
So we can see like how confusing this conversation gets because of not clarifying semantics, right? Let's just take everything he said. P1 is false because a transgender person doesn't have to hold a belief, right? So there's one disagreement. What transgender means. They both disagree on that. Ask Yourself supports his position by offering his own definition. His own definition, they have another semantic disagreement on how to even label what this particular concept is. Not to mention the confusion between using gender identity and just gender basically interchangeably without acknowledging whether or not these mean the same thing. So we got like three layers here of just semantic confusion going on in this conversation that aren't being cleared up. They're not being acknowledged, right? Like either you guys can agree to dictionary definitions, and if both participants agree that that's the authoritative usage, right? Then you have to figure out which authority you want to use. Do you want to go to psychology? Do you want to go to Google Dictionary or Wikipedia of all places? Or do you want to just grant each other's, well, for the other option is to yell at each other and see who wins that battle. Or you can just grant each other's definitions to try and make some bloody headway. That's the approach that I suggest.
One second. For everyone who's listening, right? I'm of course, and for everyone who's listening, I'm of course aware of the other problems here. Like he's equivocating on gender and sex. There's other issues there. I'm just picking out one particularly blatant issue, right?
Okay,
which is
listen. Here's the problem with what you're saying.
He's assuming.
So I hate when he does things like this. It's just to say it's a blatant issue, not to mention all the other issues. It's like, where did you establish that the issues were hypocrites problems? As an outsider looking in on this conversation, the entire problem is that you guys have different definitions, and that's not a person's fault, right? It's just people acquire words, they hear them in different contexts, they internalize what those words mean, and then they encounter people who have gone through a different process, learned those words in other different contexts, and now have a different understanding than them. You can't just declare that it's someone else's fault.
assuming that transgender people actually have to have a belief that they're trans. They don't. If their gender and their sex differ, they're trans.
Okay, Isaac. So we agree that there's such thing as you can have an idea that there are certain behaviors that are gendered. Like wearing a dress is a more female behavior. Women tend to wear dresses. Men don't.
Are you going to give an argument?
Yeah, listen, I'm doing it. So if a man wears a dress, then he's doing a female gendered behavior, but that doesn't mean that he has a female gender identity, and it doesn't mean that he's trans because he wears a dress. There's no.
So here what Hypocrite's doing is he's trying to get to this. He's trying to support this position, right? Here's an example. Here's an example of why. If a man wears a dress, then he does not necessarily have a gender of female, right? Or we'll even put identity in there because he did say identity, right? So here he's trying to, like, we go a few layers deep in the semantic conversation, and he wants to ask yourself that this is the wrong way to think of gender, right? He wants to say, listen, you know, this is why I think we should talk about gendered behaviors not being a gender. I'm going to try to support my position with an example. And if you can agree to my example, you know, then you'll understand why I have the definition I do.
Such thing as gender identity. So
we're talking about gender.
In order to be transgender, you have to believe you're the opposite sex.
Hello, no, you don't. But that's an additional problem, right? Right now, I'm just zeroing in on one extremely basic problem with what you're saying here, which is that you're assuming that transgender people have to have a belief that they're transgender.
I would much I would much prefer to never say I'm focusing on a problem you have and say on a problem we're having in solving this issue. I think that's important. But the other thing is, as you can see, there's different layers to this problem. What underpins this disagreement? Well, you know, it's these things. Well, why can't we get to the root of this thing? Well, it's because we have two different conceptualizations of what this description matches, right? So the idea is to, when you're having disagreements, you find out what underpins them, right? Well, the reason we can't come to an agreement about this is because, you know, we disagree about this. We disagree about this because of this. Then if you can resolve that, then it in turn resolves that, and then it in turn resolves the primary dispute. That's the hope. Ask Yourself wants to say, fuck what underpins our discussion. Fuck it. Who cares about what the problem with our disagreement is? Let's just go back and argue about the first thing. What's the point? What's the point? If you don't find out what the underlying problem is in your conceptualizations, in your definitions, and the way you look at things, then you're not going to get anywhere.
You could be transgender and not know that you're transgender. There's a whole, you know, don't you think?
So he just goes back to the top and asserts it, right? Like, maybe if I just use a really strong assertion, I'll win.
People kind of sometimes discover this about themselves.
You can wake up one day and decide you're transgender because there's no empirical. Transgender is just a delusion. So you can decide one day, hey, I have this delusion. Yeah.
You could be delusional about not being transgender. Also, just pointing that out. You're assuming in your premise one of the syllogism.
You can be delusional and not, right? So if this holds, right? Because this holds. So if this holds, if Ask Yourself's right about this, then Ask Yourself's right about this. If Ask Yourself's right about this, then Ask Yourself's right about this. Not particularly this one, but whatever. And then if this was the, you know, quote unquote correct definition of transgender, then his point about P1 being wrong would be right, right? That's a lot of assertion work though, right? You kind of have to get people to agree with it.
Which, I'll post it again here. Double syllogism. We formalized your argument for you. You're assuming in premise
Again,
one
it's
of the
just
first
going back to
argument
the top.
that
It's not good.
transgender women have to have a belief, right? They have to believe that they don't. They could be wrong about the fact that they're trans, right? They could even have a belief that they're not trans and be delusional that they're not trans. What qualifies you as trans is having a gender and a sex which differ. There's not a need for them to have a belief about being trans. So your premise one is just straightforwardly false, and I'm asking you for an argument that doesn't assume that transgender people have to have a belief about being trans. And that's to set aside the other problems about how you're
it's in the definition. You're acting as if transgenderism is some kind of empirical thing that people are born with or that exists in their brain or whatever, but there's no way that you just decided that's what it is, but there's no proof of that. There's no.
So now, like, this is like, I don't agree with Hypocrite's point that there's no empirical way of verifying it, because ask yourself, did offer something that would be empirical? I mean, maybe not this half, right? This would take some extrapolation from ask yourself to define what he means by a psychological characteristic that's not behavioral, right? Because that would mean this would have to be some sort of exclusive thing. And other than people's behaviors, I don't know what we could say is empirical. Like, I've looked into your head and see how you think. So I would say it was just purely behavioral in order for him to say it was empirical. So maybe Hypocrite's got a point because of the psychological aspect of this definition. But at least Ask Yourself has offered something that was slightly empirical, right? Behavioral traits.
Evidence. There's certainly no proof.
Do you actually have an argument, IHIP, that shows that if someone's gender identity and sex differ, then they are delusional?
See, now he's saying gender identity again. When he's saying we're just talking about... I really hate that he just keeps going back and forth.
There's no such thing as gender identity. That's not a real thing.
We've been through this. This is
trans
the third...
people...
Wait, 1 second. We've been through this. We've been through this. This is, I think, the third time now. First of all, gender identity, that's going to be some like subset of gender. We're just talking about gender broadly, right? Now, when you say,
now we are.
If you try to say that gender is incoherent, you'll already agree gender is coherent. You understand that there's a set of...
He has not agreed that gender is coherent because he does not believe that this is gender.
Characteristics that are typically associated with sex, physiological or psychological character.
You have to get Hypocrite to agree that that's what gender is, right? You can't tell him he agrees, right? Okay, Hypocrite can agree that this exists, but not agree that this constitutes a gender, which has been Hypocrite's position. So you cannot tell Hypocrite that he agrees because he agrees with this, that he therefore agrees with this. That's the problem. As I've outlined here, there's a reason that Hypocrite doesn't make that link. He's given an example of why he doesn't make that link. But Ask Yourself is saying, this has been settled. We already went through this. You agree with me. He doesn't agree with you. This is where the conversation is right now. This is what needs to be resolved to move forward.
Characteristics, we can have expressive characteristics. That's what gender is, okay? And if your gender differs from your sex, you are transgender.
So if I put on a dress, I'm transgender. That's your position. If I put on a dress, that makes me transgender. I don't have to believe that I'm not. I just have to put on a dress. By your definition.
Your premise one assumes that transgender people have to have a belief about being trans. They don't. A transgender person is someone whose gender identity and sex differ.
Your definition of gender identity and trans means that anybody who does something that is like not strictly within their gender is trans. So everybody is trans in your world.
Can you deliver an argument that establishes that someone is delusional in virtue of having differing gender identity and sex?
Now he's back to identity again.
Sorry, say that again?
Can you deliver an argument that shows that someone is delusional in virtue of their gender and sex differing?
there's no so sex is something that we can empirically measure. There's no way to say this person's gender is not matching up because gender you can't measure gender. It's not a real thing, dude.
We've already agreed.
All right. So asking for the argument again is doing this. Do you have an argument that shows me this? Right. That's what happens every time Ask Yourself asks this question. The reason that it's like this to Hypocrite is because of this particular issue. This issue is not being clarified. This issue would be clarified if this could be clarified, right? If Ask Yourself says yes, right? Well, then you might be able to move forward. If no, then he needs to clarify the position. But you can actually start building up. Asking him for an argument against an unclarified definition. Give me an argument against an unclarified definition is not a way to progress this argument. It'll never work.
It's a real thing. You understand that there's
a
set of characteristics.
There's characteristics that you can say are more feminine or more masculine. But Isaac, you understand that if a man puts on a dress, that doesn't make them transgender. Do you understand that?
Those characteristics.
Do you?
And 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 those characteristics.
Do you?
Shoot,
characteristics.
Do you? Do you?
And those characteristics.
Do you?
And those characteristics.
Isaac, do you understand that a man putting on a dress doesn't become transgender by virtue of putting on a dress? In order for a man to be transgender, the man has to identify as a female.
And those characteristics.
I like how he's just Ask Yourself is so calm. It's like in his mind, he's like, I'm literally going to repeat this forever. I would love to see what would happen if he met someone who was just as stubborn as him, and they just did that for like an hour. That would be great.
Are what we're referring to when we use the word gender. You agree the characteristics exist. Now, do you have an argument that shows that if someone's gender and sex differ, they're delusional?
Do you have any evidence that you can determine what a person's...
Right, so that's a huge part of the problem of this conversation, is that Ask Yourself is because you've agreed to this is the case, that you agree that that constitutes a gender, right? Hypocrite's position is that's not the case. Ask Yourself's position is it is the case. Unless you actually address that, you will go nowhere.
Gender identity is.
Do you think that's an answer to the question? What is the argument, IHIP, that if someone's gender and sex differ, they're delusional? Right? We extracted a first syllogism set from you.
There's no such thing as a person having a gender.
We extracted.
People don't have.
We already established that there is.
No, I agree that behaviors can be characterized as being more masculine or more feminine. That's what I agreed with. I didn't say that means a person has a gender.
I'm gonna try to walk you through this.
No, I think Hypocrite stated his position very clearly there.
You understand that your first premise assumes that transgender people have to have a belief about their...
Yeah, by definition, a trans woman is a man who identifies as a woman.
Now, that whatever you're attacking there, it's sure not what I'm referring to by transgender. Transgenderism is when someone's gender and sex differ. Now, do you have an argument that shows that someone is delusional in virtue of their gender and sex differing?
Isaac, there's no such thing as a gender differing from sex.
We're going in circles. We've already established what a gender is. We understand it.
Can you
see that's where Ask Yourself's right. You guys are going in circles.
Can you answer my question? Can you just answer my question? Are you capable of telling me, does a man become transgender when he puts on a dress? Is that your definition of transgender? Is a man who does anything which is not considered culturally masculine?
Your objection to what I'm saying is to say there's some kind of problem with the notion of gender. Now, when I walk you through what gender means,
the way you're using it. It's the way you're using it is incorrect.
When I walk you through what gender means, you tell me, oh, that's coherent and that exists, right?
You did not agree to that. And also, it's just very disingenuous to say, when I walk you through what it means, right? The disagreement is semantic. So you cannot take yourself as an authority for the semantics.
So there's no going to, oh, gender is incoherent, or gender doesn't exist, or you can't have a gender, right? You agree it's coherent. You agree it exists.
No, you're making
now,
leaps, though, from what I agree
with.
To...
Okay, wait, well, then let's clear that up. Do you agree that gender exists?
No. It's a
I love how emphatically he said no. He's like, no, that's what I've been saying this entire time.
It's a social construct, or whatever they say.
Oh, great. So you don't agree that there's a set of characteristics that are associated with...
No, that is not what he said, right? It is only if I, hypocrite, shares
being one
that...
of the others.
It's not oops. It's only if I, hypocrite, agrees that this and this are the same thing that he would have agreed with what you just said, right? Your failure to make sure that I, hypocrite, has made that establishment, right? That link of this word to this definition is the entire problem, and it's why you can't move forward. But ask yourself seems convinced. He seems absolutely convinced that I, hypocrite, has agreed with that connection. At no point has he. In fact, he's tried to make arguments against it.
An empirical thing you can measure. Like, it's not scientific.
That's not an answer. Do you agree that there's a set of characteristics associated with being one or the other sex? We're talking behavioral characteristics.
Yeah.
Okay, great. That's gender. And
see, he just says, okay, great, you agree. That's gender. He doesn't agree to that.
Do you agree that you can have one biological sex and have the gender, that is to say, those characteristics typically associated with the other sex?
You don't have a gender.
Can you? Yes or no?
I reject the idea that you have a gender.
Can you have what we're referring to by gender is that set of characteristics typically associated with
putting on a dress
sex,
or having tits isn't a behavior. So you can get plastic surgery to have tits, but that doesn't mean you have a gender.
It's like arguing with a complete. It's not like arguing with a complete moron. It is arguing with a complete moron. You understand what gender refers to. You understand that a male can have the gender, right?
You don't have a gender. You don't have a gender.
Oh, well, by having a gender, all we mean is that you engage in those behaviors. You have those traits that are...
What we mean. Who is the we that Ask Yourself is referring to when he says that? What we mean by gender is... that's very confusing.
Associated typically with a given sex.
First of all, I wouldn't use that definition, but even if I go by that definition, that doesn't mean you would be transgender by doing that, because that's not what transgender means.
Transgenderism is having a gender that differs from your sex.
People don't have genders.
Oh, well, do they have the traits that are typically associated with one or the other sex?
Maybe generally speaking, you could say that.
Great. So they have genders.
But that's like it's just a choice, basically.
If someone's that's irrelevant. That's irrelevant. If someone's gender and their sex differ, then they're transgender. Right?
I personally just like to give my take on like where I stand on it. I don't really agree with Ask Yourself's definition. Typically because I do think this is a problematic reductio with the way that he's defining it. I wouldn't call someone having a gender because they did one thing that's typical of the opposite gender, right? So that's sort of a problem with the view. So I wouldn't connect this with this either myself. But if I'm just talking about like the breakdowns in this conversation, it's just that Ask Yourself seems convinced that these two concepts, that this word means this definition, and he's completely unwilling to accept or even understand that I, hypocrite, doesn't, right? He just seems to be assuming that if I, hypocrite, agrees that this exists, that this definition is something in the world, that he must be agreeing that this word is therefore justified as used. But I think what Hypocrite is saying is I don't want to call it a gender, right? Because that carries more baggage than this. And I think I agree with that, right? If I said you have a female gender, it seems to mean more than just like you wore a dress once, right? So I think it needs more clarification.
You can't measure gender. You can't measure it. It's not the same. You can measure sex. Right? You can test for sex. You can't test for gender. There's no such thing.
Listen, you fucking moron. Okay? Try to get your stupid little brain around this. It's really not that hard. Okay? Transgenderism.
I don't know why anybody puts up with that.
That's referring to the phenomenon of having a gender and a sex that differ. When you make an argument that transgenderism is a delusion, but your argument, setting aside all of its other problems, like the gender-sex equivocation, only targets a subset of trans people who have a particular belief about their gender.
See, Ask Yourself thinks it's a subset. Hypocrite thinks it's a necessary requirement to be transgender. That's just a difference in definitions.
You're not showing that transgenderism is a delusion. It's like if you try to say cars suck and you give a really long screed about how you don't like Volvo. Do you think that that's established that cars suck?
No, that's not right at all, because you're just using a made-up, incorrect definition of what transgender is.
That's a perfect analogy.
No, it's not.
Right? And the reason that the analogy is perfect, IHIP, is because you are delivering a syllogism which targets a subset of some group and tries to establish something about them.
That's
and
wrong.
You're claiming, oh, wait, so you're
claiming
that
doesn't
all
believe
trans
that
people have
it's
to
a
have the
subset.
belief that their gender and sex differ.
Yeah, by definition.
No, you can be trans without knowing that you're trans.
I reject that. I reject that. That's not true.
Right. So can you actually
prove that it's true? How would you determine? How does somebody else? So you're saying somebody else could determine that you're trans for you? Is that what you're telling me?
No, I'm saying there's a fact of the matter. Now, I'm asking
so you think that being trans is a factual, like something that exists in like physical reality? That's like
Absolutely.
a fact about
there's
people.
A fact of the matter. Yeah, there's a fact of the matter, right?
What leads you to that belief? How do you reach that conclusion? How do you reach that conclusion?
Just one second. What
is
this?
That might be a useful question, but I think they already have things to clear up.
Is Darth in here too? Okay, well, wait. Maybe Darth and IHIP can go after.
No. I'm not talking to that fucking guy.
Okay. But anyway, so what we're talking about right now, right? You have delivered this double syllogism, okay? I'll post it again. I think I have it here.
What led you to the belief that being trans is the fact of the matter? How did you reach that conclusion?
Do you care? Listen, you fucking idiot. Do you care about having a sound argument, an argument that's valid and has true premises, or do you just want to believe your fucking conclusion for no reason, you fucking idiot?
Like, in order for it to be sound, you have to have definitions for these words, right? So you're going to have to agree to a definition, even if it's just tentatively, right? Even if it's just an acknowledgement that you say it differently than I say it, and then you can analyze it through both definitions. This whole thing is just one big pain in the ass because of a giant refusal to do so.
Do you want a sound argument or not?
You're the one who doesn't have a sound argument, dude.
Do you want a sound argument or not?
Do you want a sound argument?
Do you want a sound argument or not, you fucking moron?
Isaac, do you want a sound argument or not?
Because
if you have this conclusion that being trans is the fact of the matter, you need to explain how...
Do you want a sound argument, you fucking idiot? Do you even know what it means for an argument? Hey, IHIP, what's it mean for an argument to be sound, you fucking moron?
That's if you can hear it with your ears, right?
Hey...
I mean, we can obviously see it breaking down.
IHIP, what's an argument being sound mean?
That's when you can hear it with your ears.
IHIP, what's an argument being sound mean?
Isaac, are trans women women?
What's it mean for an argument to be sound?
Are trans women women?
What's it mean, IHIP? You don't even know. You don't know the first thing. You don't know the first thing about logic.
I know.
I don't know why he needs to know the first thing about logic. Just throwing that out there. You know, it's really not important whether he knows what the word sound is. I mean, that's not going to clear up your definitional issues that you're having in this conversation. Like, yelling at someone, you know, why don't you start yelling at them, what is a material conditional? Or why don't I just start yelling at him because, you know, he uses this wrong? I could do that. I don't see what this accomplishes.
Which is why you do not give a shit about having an argument that's actually sound. Right? Now, if you would like to understand what soundness means, it refers to the combination of validity, which I've helped you with because you're incapable of spelling out a valid argument, and true premises. Now, I grant you that the form is valid. It is modus ponens. P implies Q. P, therefore Q. Now, I am taking issue with your first premise, okay? The issue that I'm taking, although there are plenty of other issues to take, is that you are not targeting trans people as a category, okay? You are targeting a subset of the category who have a belief about their gender. You don't require that belief in order to be trans. So do you have a sound argument that establishes that someone is delusional in virtue of their gender and sex?
So we've really gotten nowhere in 20 minutes, right? In this entire, how long has this video been running? 35 minutes. 35 minutes, and essentially we've had 3 problems, right? They disagree with transgender means. They have different definitions of transgender. One of the problems is that Ask Yourself wants an argument for his definition of transgender. There's no reason why the conversation needs to go there, right? Like, Ask Yourself can analyze the argument based off of Hypocrite's definition. That's certainly one way you can go. I think I wrote that. Yeah, Ask Yourself could recognize Hypocrite's definition and then dispute it using that definition. That's one way you can go. But Ask Yourself offers a different definition. Hypocrite says there's a problem with that definition. There's a reason we can't use your definition of transgender. And that's because I don't think gender identity is a thing, right? So Ask Yourself's asking for an argument for his definition of transgender. Unfortunately, you know, this is all Hypocrite hears, right? He doesn't think gender identity is a thing, so he's just hearing nonsense. So Ask Yourself's asking for an argument against this statement. Hypocrite can't possibly deliver one because he doesn't think it's a thing. So then Ask Yourself says, look, I'll give you a definition of what it means, right? It's a person whose gender identity and sex differ, and to clear up gender, I'm going to say it's a group of characteristics that are typically associated with a sex, behavior, or psychological. Now, Hypocrite says, okay, I see that, but I don't think we can call that a gender. I think calling it a gender is a problem. We should only call it gendered behaviors and not say that someone has a gender, right? This is why I think we can't do that. That's as far as the entire conversation in 35 minutes has gone. Everything else is posturing. It's just stupid posturing and asserting that your definition is correct. Phrasing things as if, you know, the semantic issues that you guys are having are the other person's fault, right? This is more on Ask Yourself's side. I don't really agree with Hypocrite's point that Ask Yourself's definition can't be empirically verified, because I think he's given himself some room for that. But needless to say, he's saying there's reasons that we shouldn't accept your definition, right? So I can't accept your definition, so I can't make an argument against it, and there's no reason why I should have to make an argument against it, because I already made an argument using my definition. Can we address that? None of that's going to get resolved. It's all just yelling and assertions. This is not how you have productive debates. This is not going to progress anything.
Differing, you fucking idiot.
Are trans women
And calling people fucking idiots doesn't really help either.
and women?
Do you have an argument that shows that someone is delusional in virtue of their gender and sex differing?
I think you
Are
can tell they're
trans
pretty
women
fed
Do
up of
you
each
have an
other at this
argument that
point.
shows that someone is delusional in virtue of their gender and sex differing?
There's no such thing as gender, and
We've
I would
already
need you
been
to
through
explain
this,
how did
IHIP.
you
We've already been through this.
Right, so,
we understand.
Isaac, where we're
we
at,
understand
that
there's a
you
set
have
of
to explain
characteristics
on what
that
do
are
you base the
associated with
conclusion
one or
that
the
being
other
trans
sex.
is the fact of the matter.
We've been through it, so you don't get to say that, oh, I have some problem with the notion of gender. You want me to walk you through it again?
I want you to. No. You are. No. We don't have to go
Are
through
there
that again.
characteristics associated with one or
Isaac.
the other sex?
Isaac.
Are there? Hey,
Isaac.
IHIP, are there characteristics associated with one or the other sex? Yes or no?
Sure.
Great. That's what we're talking about with
Okay.
gender. Now, can those characteristics differ from the biological sex?
Oh shit! Someone said something funny in the chat. Can you tell me how you reached the conclusion that being trans is the fact of the matter?
Can those characteristics differ from the biological sex?
Like, can a man wear a dress? Is that what you're asking me?
That would be one of many of those characteristics.
Yeah, but that doesn't make the man transgender.
Great.
That's not what being transgender is.
That is what I am referring to by transgenderism, which is when your gender and your sex.
He's referring to transgenderism as when a man puts on a dress?
Differ, okay? Now, I'm asking you.
Wearing a dress doesn't make you a woman.
I'm
Isaac.
asking you.
Wearing a dress doesn't make you a woman.
You're straw manning me. You're straw manning me
No,
down.
I'm not. That's what you're saying. That's exactly what you're saying. That's
you're straw manning me to saying.
That's the reductio of what you're saying.
I mean, I have to agree. That does seem to be what Ask Yourself has been saying.
Do you know what a reductio is, Isaac?
Straw manning me into saying.
Do you know what a reductio
one
is?
gender characteristic determines your gender. I did not say that.
Oh.
So he didn't say that one gender characteristic determines your gender, but he also didn't really give a number. So we don't really know how many characteristics it requires. So the way that Ask Yourself has been defining it is having, it's just a group of characteristics. I mean, I guess that might rule out having only one characteristic because it needs to be a group. But it also doesn't really say, you know, how big does that group have to be? And it also seems to have the same problems that Hypocrite is already brought up. So, like, I could add, you know, wears a dress, wearing high heels, and lipstick, right? Is that, and he does it once, does that constitute having a new gender? Like, what is the amount? Or does the different things you do have more values? Does it mean more to wear a dress than it does to use other female expressions? I don't know.
So you have a methodology for determining.
And it would also mean that someone can't say, right? So but I think Ask Yourself would agree to that. If somebody wore a dress consistently, a man wore a dress consistently, and like makeup and stuff, and said, no, I identify as a man. I just like dresses, and I like makeup, but I identify as a man. Ask Yourself might say he's deluded and that he's actually female gendered because he has, maybe it's a majorative thing, I'm not sure.
Gender. What is your methodology for determining gender?
If someone has...
What is your methodology for determining gender?
If someone has one gender characteristic, which goes in the female direction, and all of the others go in the male direction, we're not going to say that they have a female gender, so you're straw-manning me.
So now you're claiming you have an empirical way of measuring.
Right. So I don't know if he's... straw manning because ask yourself's position isn't clear. I think asking him what is the methodology is a good question. Of course, the entire yelling at each other is completely unnecessary, but it sort of helps clarify what ask yourself's position might be.
Someone's gender.
You are straw manning me when you say that my position is that someone is trans in virtue of wearing a dress.
No, that's exactly what you're saying.
Now listen to me.
That's what you.
Well, if he's saying that's exactly what you're saying, well, I mean, he's saying that that isn't the case, so now I think he is straw manning him. Before, when it wasn't clear, it doesn't seem like a straw man. But now that he's clarified his position, it does seem like a straw man.
Brain dead. Listen to me, you brain dead fucking idiot. I want you to deliver a sound argument that establishes that someone is delusional in virtue of their gender and sex differing. Can you do it? Yes or no?
Isaac, I think you're actually bringing
you
your...
do it.
Oh,
yes
goodness.
Or no.
What is
I am giving you one more chance. Can you deliver a sound argument that establishes that someone is delusional in virtue of their gender and sex differing? You have one shot to give a yes or no answer.
Not miss your chance to blow.
No!
I need to know the methodology for determining someone's gender.
You're fucking gone, Have a good day.
Oh, wow. What a conclusion, right? So he's saying, oh, you got one shot to deliver this argument against my position, which I'm not going to clarify. Kind of a problem. Kind of a problem. I can't really give you an argument against your position unless I know what exactly constitutes a gender. We know that wearing just a dress isn't quite enough, but we don't know what is enough, right? I don't really know. So it would be hard to deliver an argument against it. Even then, even if you agreed with that, that's only ask yourself's definition of gender, which Hypocrite hasn't agreed to, and which I think he's raised issues with why we might not want to think about it like that. Then we go up to this part, and we might not even say that that's good enough to call it transgender, right? Hypocrite would disagree that even if he establishes this particular definition, that he might not agree that this is what a transgender person is, right? Because they have a different definition there, too. Different definitions on transgender, different definitions on whether gender actually means a group of characteristics, and whether we should even think of gender characteristics as leading to gender because of some reductio issues. Those are the sorts of things that need to be clarified, but in order to do that, you need to be able to identify where arguments are being broken down. For the people who watch Ask Yourself, there's this big propensity to put everything into logical syllogisms, find out the inference structure. This is what I want to point out as the type of conversation that has nothing to do with logical structure, right? The breakdown isn't the logical structure. They're very simple arguments, right? The inference structure is very simple. What's difficult is sorting out these words, right? Sorting out what gender identity means, sorting out what transgender means, right? Should we think that characteristics should lead to a gender? Those things, you know, you kind of have to explain where you're coming from, explain your concepts, forge a common language game. Find a way to have that conversation. If you're unable to do that, you're going to get a 39-minute video that ends up in screaming at each other in acts of lunacy. When I was talking about the principle of charity earlier, I think Ask Yourself needs this principle of charity in order to grant other people that their definitions are just as valid as his definitions, right? Unless you guys are going to agree to, you know, Wikipedia as the master definition that no one could deviate from. And even then, you know, you can disagree with what the definition means, like words in the definition. So, you know, part of the definition was gender identity. then you might disagree what gender identity is. And then I guess you could appeal to Wikipedia again on what gender identity is. But unless you guys are going to agree that there's a dictionary authoritative source that's independent of you two, then you're really only left with screaming and asserting at each other, or granting each other's definitions tentatively in order to view arguments through that lens. That's the way I suggest these conversations go. Unfortunately, it went the latter way. It was just a ton of assertion. Hypocrite was more willing to realize that they had different definitions and that this was going to cause an issue for the conversation than Ask Yourself was, right? So in order for Ask Yourself to improve as an interlocutor into having these sorts of debates, then I think he's going to have to improve on how to clear up semantic issues, right? No, don't just put things into syllogisms. That's not going to do it. And I guess that's all I really wanted to say. I hope everybody enjoys this video. It's very long now at this point. So I hope you took something away from it. I hope that when you have conversations with someone else and you start disagreeing, that you might, clue in that there's this word that you guys are clearly using differently, and that you don't just start asserting each other is wrong in order to try and fix that issue. Right? Not the best way to go. This is sort of the conclusion of it. So good luck to everybody with your critical thinking and your arguments in the future. And if I feel like making another video at some point, I will. And I'll see you then.